During a routine cleanup of her grandmother's house, a teenage girl discovers a locked box in the attic. Inside, she uncovers old documents revealing her grandfather's secret identity. An old forgotten box in the attic. Emily, a curious young girl, stumbles upon secrets her family never imagined. Who was the man everyone knew as James? In a frantic search for answers, she delves into a story of false identity, secret military operations, and a past that threatens. Emily, a 16-year-old girl, was spending her summer vacation at her grandmother's house in a small town in rural Georgia. The old house was a treasure trove of memories and stories, something that had always piqued the young girl's curiosity. On a hot afternoon, while helping her grandmother, Mrs. Celeste, organize the attic, Emily stumbled upon an old wooden box hidden in a dark corner, covered in dust. The box, sturdy with a rusty padlock, seemed to hold ancient secrets. "Grandma, what's this?" Emily asked, lifting the box with some effort. Mrs. Celeste, upon seeing the box, paused for a moment, her eyes lost in memories. "Ah, that box. It belonged to your grandfather. He always kept important things there, but he never let anyone open it." The mention of her grandfather, James, who had passed away before Emily was born, stirred an irresistible curiosity in the young girl. James was remembered as a simple man, dedicated to his farm, but the box seemed to suggest there was more to his story. Determined to unravel the mystery, Emily spent the afternoon searching the house for the key. The attic, filled with old objects, seemed to hide secrets in every corner. After an exhaustive search, she found a small rusty key inside one of the old books on the shelf in the living room. With her heart racing, Emily returned to the attic. The silent, stuffy attic seemed to breathe the weight of the secrets it held. With trembling hands, she fit the key into the lock. After a few tense seconds, the lock clicked open, revealing the box's contents. Inside, she found a series of old documents, military medals, and a leather-bound notebook worn by time. Each item seemed to carry a story waiting to be told. The first document Emily picked up was a birth certificate that, to her surprise, didn't bear the name James, but rather Richard Sullivan. Confused, she continued to explore the box's contents. There were military certificates, official letters, and old photographs showing her grandfather in a military uniform, alongside people she didn't recognize. The medals were another surprise. Shiny even after so many years, they indicated bravery in combat. The notebook, filled with detailed notes, seemed to describe missions and military operations that felt like something out of a movie. Each page Emily turned increased the feeling that her grandfather had lived a life completely different from what the family knew. Emily could hardly believe what she was discovering. How was it possible that her grandfather, always remembered as a simple and peaceful man, had such a secretive past? What else could be hidden there? Determined to understand the true story of her grandfather, Emily knew she couldn't stop there. She closed the box, pocketed the key, and decided that, before anything else, she needed to investigate everything before her. The mystery had only just begun. Emily spent the rest of the day immersed in the documents and photos she had found in the box. The revelation of her grandfather's true name, Richard Sullivan, and the evidence of his military involvement created a whirlwind of thoughts in the young girl's mind. Who was the man her family knew as James? Why did he hide his true identity? That night, before going to bed, Emily hid the box under her bed, fearing that her grandmother might find it and forbid her from continuing her investigation. Anxiety kept Emily awake for most of the night, and when the sun had barely risen, she was already leafing through her grandfather's notebook again. The notebook was full of codes, names of unknown places, and references to events she couldn't fully understand. Some passages were written in a hurried script, as if they were notes taken in moments of great tension. Each line seemed to carry a secret, and Emily knew she would need time to unravel each one. During breakfast, while helping her grandmother wash the dishes, Emily tried to sound casual as she asked, Grandma, did Grandpa ever talk about his youth? What was it like before he came here? Mrs. Celeste, who was focused on scrubbing a pan, paused for a moment and looked at her granddaughter. Your grandfather was a very reserved man, Emily. He didn't like to talk about the past, and I never wanted to force him to. All he wanted was a quiet life on the farm, away from everything. Emily noticed a nostalgic tone in her grandmother's voice, but also something else. Something that seemed to be a deep sadness, perhaps from the memories her grandfather didn't want to share. And he was always James, ever since you met him? Emily asked, trying to hide her anxiety. Mrs. Celeste smiled slightly, as if recalling the moment. When we met, he was already James. It never crossed my mind that he might have had another name. This response left Emily even more intrigued. If her grandmother never knew that her grandfather had another name, that meant he had started a new life even before meeting her. What could have led her grandfather to hide his true identity? Determined to discover more, Emily spent the following days investigating every detail of the documents. Gradually, she pieced together a puzzle that revealed a man completely different from the grandfather she had imagined. Richard Sullivan, her grandfather's real name, seemed to have been a soldier involved in secret missions during a war that wasn't mentioned in history books. One of the most intriguing documents was an official letter, bearing the seal of a government agency that Emily had never heard of. The letter was brief but contained crucial information. It stated that Richard Sullivan had participated in a special operation during the war and that, after the conflict ended, he needed to disappear to protect himself and those he loved. The discovery deeply shook Emily. Not only did her grandfather have a secret identity, but he had been forced to leave behind everything he knew. The decision to hide and assume a new identity indicated that he faced real dangers and that, probably, there were still secrets the family was never meant to know. Increasingly involved in the investigation, Emily began to seek information beyond the documents. She used the internet to search for details about the agency mentioned in the letter and tried to find any clue that could connect her to her grandfather's past. However, the more she searched, the more she realized that Richard Sullivan's story was something that someone, somewhere, wanted to keep buried. Emily felt torn between admiration for her grandfather, who proved to be a man of courage and sacrifice, and sadness knowing that he had to live with such a heavy burden, hiding the truth even from his own family. She knew she was getting involved in something bigger than she had imagined, and the search for the truth was now a personal mission. In the days that followed, Emily spent hours locked in her room, immersed in the notes and documents found in the box. Each new discovery pulled her deeper into the mystery of her grandfather's true identity. During this time, her grandmother began to notice her strange behavior, but respecting her space, decided not to ask questions. Emily, on the other hand, felt a growing tension from hiding things from her grandmother, but knew that without more answers, she couldn't share what she had uncovered. As the days passed, Emily began to piece together a profile of what seemed to have been her grandfather's double life. Richard Sullivan, as she now saw him, wasn't just an ordinary soldier but part of an elite involved in secret missions, some of which were of such a sensitive nature that they weren't recorded anywhere publicly. The young girl found references to operations that couldn't be found in any history book or online archive. Some of the notes were so cryptic that they seemed to have been written to never be understood by anyone outside Richard's trusted circle. One day, while going through one of the old photos, Emily noticed a detail she had previously overlooked. In the background of one of the photos where her grandfather appeared with other men, there was a building with a partially hidden sign that contained part of a name and a location. Determined to discover more, she began investigating that place. After hours of research, Emily found that the location was an old, decommissioned military base in a remote area of the United States. The base, according to the information she managed to gather, had been used during World War II for operations involving espionage and counterintelligence. It was then that Emily realized she was dealing with something much bigger than she had imagined. Her grandfather wasn't just an ordinary soldier. He seemed to be deeply involved in operations that shaped the course of the war and possibly even the history of the country itself. The implications of this made her uneasy. Why would he have abandoned everything and assumed a new identity? What kind of enemies had he made during these operations that led him to hide for the rest of his life? Determined to uncover more, Emily began to search for accounts or memories of others who might have lived or worked with her grandfather during that time. After several days of fruitless searching, she finally found something. A small article on an obscure internet forum, written by someone who claimed to have served alongside a man named Richard Sullivan. In the account, the person mentioned how Richard had gotten involved in a secret mission that went terribly wrong and that, after the event, Richard was declared dead. This discovery was a real shock for Emily. How could her grandfather have been declared dead and at the same time have lived as James, her grandfather, for so many years? The more she tried to piece together the puzzle, the more confusing the story became. The only thing that made sense was that after this failed mission, Richard had been forced to disappear to protect himself and his family. But who were these enemies who might still be lurking, even decades later? Emily felt a chill run down her spine at the thought that her investigation might be attracting unwanted attention. She didn't know who else might be interested in these secrets, but the idea that there were people who would do anything to keep this story hidden began to weigh on her shoulders. The fear of being in danger and exposing her grandmother to these risks began to erode her determination, but the desire to uncover the truth continued to drive her. Emily knew she needed more answers and, above all, needed to talk to someone who knew her grandfather's story, someone who could confirm her suspicions. She decided then to find the author of that article. The mission was now clear. Locate this person and understand once and for all what happened to Richard Sullivan. Emily couldn't get the idea of finding the article's author out of her head. She knew this person might have the answers she was so desperately seeking. She spent the next few days trying to track down the author's identity, using every tool available on the internet. After much effort, she finally found a lead. The article's author was a man named Jack, a former military officer who now lived in seclusion in a small town in upstate New York. Determined, Emily decided she had to meet him in person. She made up an excuse to her grandmother, saying she was visiting a friend in another town, and took a bus to upstate New York. During the trip, nervousness took hold of her. What if he refused to talk? What if he was lying in his account? Emily tried to push these doubts aside, focusing on the importance of uncovering the truth. Upon arriving in the small town, she found Jack's house with relative ease. It was a simple house with a well-kept garden, indicating that someone still cared for the place. Emily took a deep breath before knocking on the door. After a few moments, an elderly man with a wary look answered. He had skin marked by time and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of painful memories. "Can I help you?" he asked in a hoarse voice. "Are you Jack?" Emily responded, trying to sound confident. "Yes, I am. And you, who are you?" Jack asked, looking her up and down. "My name is Emily. I think you knew my grandfather, Richard Sullivan," she said, watching Jack's reaction. The name seemed to awaken something in the old man. His gaze became more attentive, and he took a step back, allowing Emily to enter the house. "Richard, I haven't heard that name in decades," Jack said as he closed the door behind Emily. "You're his granddaughter? So he survived after all." Emily nodded, feeling her heart race. "Yes, but he assumed another identity. That's how he met my grandmother and built a new life. But no one in my family knows anything about what he did before." Jack sighed deeply and sat down in an old armchair, inviting Emily to do the same. "Your grandfather was an extraordinary man, but he carried many secrets. I think you have the right to know what happened, but I warn you now, the truth isn't easy to hear." Jack began to recount Richard's story, describing how he was recruited for a special operation during World War II, a mission involving infiltration into enemy territory. Richard and his elite group were responsible for gathering vital information and sabotaging enemy operations. But in one of the missions, something went terribly wrong. They were betrayed by someone from within, and the operation ended in disaster. Many of his colleagues were killed, and Richard, severely wounded, was declared dead. But he survived, Jack continued. He managed to escape, but he knew he couldn't return to normal life. There were powerful people after him, people who didn't want the truth about that operation to come to light. That's when he disappeared and became James. Emily listened to every word attentively, trying to process the idea that her grandfather had lived an entire life fleeing from enemies who never stopped searching for him. But why did he never tell anyone? Not even my grandmother. He wanted to protect them. Richard knew that if anyone discovered he was alive, his family would be the next target. So he hid everything, even from himself. The man you knew as your grandfather was a shadow of what he once was. And, in a way, he died on that mission along with the rest of us. Emily felt a tightness in her chest upon hearing this. The idea that her grandfather lived with so much fear and carried such a heavy burden throughout his life left her deeply sad. At the same time, she felt more connected to him than ever, understanding the magnitude of the sacrifices he made to protect the family. Jack ended the story with a somber look. If you're digging into these things, you need to be careful. There are people who still don't want this to be discovered. Richard made many enemies, and some of them might still be alive. If you continue with this, you could end up attracting trouble for yourself. Jack's warning echoed in Emily's mind as she returned home. She knew the truth was dangerous, but she felt she owed it to her grandfather to expose his true story. Emily returned home with her mind in turmoil after Jack's revelations. The story she heard was hard to process, but it explained many things about her grandfather's behavior and the life he chose for himself. As the bus traveled the winding roads, she reflected on Jack's words and the burden of carrying such a dark secret. When she arrived home, she was greeted by Mrs. Celeste, who embraced her with the usual warmth. "How was your trip, dear? Did you manage to see your friend?" Emily hesitated for a moment, but knew it wasn't the right time to share what she had discovered. "It was fine, Grandma. It was good to get out for a bit and clear my head." Mrs. Celeste smiled, but something in her eyes suggested she noticed something was different. Even so, she didn't press Emily, respecting her granddaughter's space. In the following days, Emily continued to explore the documents and notes from the box, trying to piece together the puzzle that Jack had helped assemble. She began to understand more deeply her grandfather's sacrifice and the life of solitude he must have led, always looking over his shoulder, fearing his past would catch up with him. But Jack's warning still echoed in her mind. What if digging into these things brought trouble to her family? Emily knew that the information she had could attract unwanted attention, and she didn't want to put her grandmother in danger. However, the truth called to her with an irresistible force, and the idea of exposing her grandfather's true story was something she felt she had to do. With this dilemma in mind, Emily decided she needed to consult someone she could trust. She remembered a friend of her father's, Mr. Davis, a lawyer who had worked on complicated cases involving the government and knew how to handle delicate situations. Without hesitation, she arranged a meeting with him at his office in the city. When Emily arrived at Mr. Davis's office, she was greeted with a warm smile. He had always been a considerate man, well regarded by her family, and Emily knew she could trust him. "So, Emily, what brings you here today?" he asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. Emily took a deep breath and began to recount the entire story from the beginning. She talked about the box, the documents, her grandfather's true identity, and the conversation she had with Jack. Mr. Davis listened attentively, not interrupting, and when she finished, he remained silent for a few moments, reflecting on what he had heard. "This is very serious, Emily," he finally said. "What you found could have much bigger implications than you realize. If the people involved in that operation are still out there, they won't want this story to come to light." Emily felt a chill upon hearing this, but she wasn't surprised. "I know, Mr. Davis, but I feel like I have to do something. I can't just let this stay hidden." What Grandpa did was important, and he deserves to be recognized. Mr. Davis smiled slightly, admiring the young girl's determination. You're brave, Emily, and that's admirable, but you need to be very careful. If you decide to move forward, you'll need to ensure you're protected, and that your grandmother is safe too. Emily nodded. She knew she couldn't act recklessly. Mr. Davis suggested she keep the documents well secured, perhaps even in a location outside the house, and take precautions before disclosing anything. He also offered to help, using his contacts to investigate Richard's operation further, but discreetly. Emily left Mr. Davis's office feeling somewhat relieved, knowing she had someone she could trust to help her handle the situation. But the weight of the secret was still there, and she knew that, eventually, she would have to make difficult choices. Back at her grandmother's house, Emily approached Mrs. Celeste and embraced her, feeling the safety and love she had always found there. She knew she had to protect her grandmother at all costs, but she also knew that her grandfather's legacy couldn't remain buried forever. The decision was made. Emily would move forward, but she would do so cautiously, seeking justice for her grandfather's story without compromising her family's safety. In the weeks that followed, Emily fully dedicated herself to the mission of bringing her grandfather's true story to light. With Mr. Davis's help, she began gathering all the evidence and organizing the information into a cohesive narrative. The process was slow and careful, as they knew any wrong move could attract unwanted attention. Mr. Davis managed to contact some of his old colleagues who had access to historical archives and classified military documents. Slowly, more pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. They discovered that the operation Richard Sullivan had been involved in was one of the riskiest and most secretive of its time, aimed at dismantling a network of enemy spies operating within the United States. However, this mission was compromised by a traitor, leading to the near-total annihilation of the team. Richard, Emily's grandfather, survived, but at a very high cost. To escape the revenge of the spies he helped capture and the interests of powerful people who preferred the operation never be revealed, he was forced to go into hiding and change his identity. James, the quiet farmer everyone knew, was the refuge Richard had created for himself, far from the shadows of a dangerous past. Emily and Mr. Davis decided that the best way to share the story was through a book. Emily dedicated herself to writing it, with a maturity that surprised everyone around her. In the text, she detailed Richard's life, his courage and sacrifice, and how he reinvented himself to protect his family. But she also made sure to address the emotional and psychological impact that a life of secrets had on him and those around him. During this process, Emily grew even closer to her grandmother. Although she still hadn't told Mrs. Celeste everything, Emily began to ask more direct questions about her grandfather, and her grandmother's answers now made much more sense in light of what Emily had discovered. One day, as they were sitting on the porch, Emily, with a heavy heart, decided it was time to reveal the truth. "Grandma, I need to tell you something about Grandpa," she began, holding her grandmother's hand. Mrs. Celeste looked at Emily with tenderness, but also with a concerned expression. "What is it, dear? What did you discover?" Emily then told her everything. About the box, the documents, her grandfather's true identity, and the revelations that had come to light in recent weeks. Mrs. Celeste listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When Emily finished, her grandmother embraced her tightly, as if wanting to protect her from all the pain that those revelations had brought. "I knew he kept secrets, Emily," Mrs. Celeste said with a trembling voice. "I always knew there was something he wasn't telling me, but I never imagined it was so serious, so dangerous. James or Richard, he was a good man. He loved me, and that's all that mattered to me. But now I understand why he never wanted to talk about the past." Emily wiped the tears from her own face and squeezed her grandmother's hand. "Grandma, I want to tell his story to the world. I think he deserves to be recognized for what he did, not just remembered as a farmer. He was a hero, even if he had to hide." Mrs. Celeste nodded slowly. If that's what you think is right, dear, then do it. But please be careful. I don't want to lose you too." With her grandmother's blessing, Emily and Mr. Davis finished the book and sent it to a publisher. The publishing process was slow, but when the book was finally released, it made a big impact. The story of Richard Sullivan, the man who lived a double life to protect his family, gained national attention. Newspapers and TV programs began talking about the case, and Richard's name was finally recognized as a hero in American history. The book brought to light truths that many wanted to keep buried, but it also gave Emily a sense of purpose and connection to her grandfather that she never expected to find. The young girl, who had initially only found a locked box in the attic, now saw herself as the guardian of a legacy of courage and sacrifice. Mrs. Celeste, despite all the pain of the revelations, felt proud of what her granddaughter had done. She understood that although the secrets of the past were heavy, it was important for them to be known so that they could finally be understood and honored. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Emily realized how much she had grown and matured during this journey. She learned that the truth, no matter how painful, needs to be confronted, and that the stories of our lives, even the most difficult ones, are what make us who we are. Richard Sullivan's secret was unearthed, and with it, peace was finally restored to Emily and her grandmother's lives.